Hello, Year 7. Thanks very much for joining us today for our lesson. I want to say thank you for all the hard work you've done so far, and before half term when we met, you did amazingly well in that lesson, and so well done. Hopefully we won't have live lessons much longer because, as you know, we're going to be going back to school in another week or so. But for today's lesson, I'd like you to use today's little pre-recorded video and the worksheet on class charts to complete it. So we're going to be looking at the question today of why was the church angry with King John. We're going to be looking at why he was unpopular with the church in particular, and we're going to be focusing our energy on source evidence. We're going to be looking at, remember, a source is a piece of evidence from the past. We're going to be looking at some sources and thinking about why these sources are quite negative about King John, and we're going to be thinking about how we can analyze and use sources to get an accurate picture of the past. So as a starter task for today, we looked at the Magna Carta last lesson, and as a reminder, the Magna Carta is a list of rules that King John had to follow and that he was made to sign in 1215 by the barons. And these rules are super important. Many of them we still sort of use today. And this was the first time really that a king's power had been limited in some way. So what I'd like you to do is imagine that you had to write your own Magna Carta for Bishop Challoner. What are the 5 golden rules that all students and teachers would have to follow if you wrote your own Magna Carta for our school? For example, one of them might be that teachers have to can only set homework if they get permission from all students in the class. That could be one of your rules. Can you think of your own rules, 5 of which that you'd put into your Magna Carta? And there's a couple of other questions there for you to have a go at. Why is the Magna Carta an important document on our history? So think back to last lesson. Why do you think this is such an important document in history? And then 3, can you think of any of the rules on the Magna Carta that we still follow today? So there's a few things on there that we still have in our modern law. Can you identify those and write them down? Just pause the video, then have a go at those 3 tasks, and then when you're finished, unpause. Okay, thanks very much. Hopefully you've had a good go at that and you've thought about your 5 Magna Carta rules. I always love reading those, they're always interesting. Now, the Magna Carta was, as I said, a super important document in history, and there's actually 4 copies of it still around today, and one of them is in Salisbury Cathedral. And last year, it was in the news because a man tried to smash and steal this document, which is kind of protected in a glass case. He was unsuccessful in doing so, but the reason he did this is because apparently he claimed that the Magna Carta wasn't real, that this wasn't really something that was 800 years old. Well, it actually is, and it's still an incredibly important document and insight into the past. So if you did ever want to go and see it, it's in Salisbury. Just try to see it the normal way and try not to smash and steal it like this guy did, because you will get arrested and put in prison for it. Now, when it comes to the Magna Carta, we know that John had many different problems with the barons. He was very unpopular with the barons, and there's lots of reasons for that, and in the end they went to war with him and he had to sign the Magna Carta. And it all sort of starts with the fact that John in 1200 married a French girl called Isabella, a French princess. She was only 12 years at the time, or 12 years old, which is a bit yucky, isn't it? And because of this, he ended up going to war with France, among other reasons as well, and he loses lots of land in France, which earns him the nickname Soft Sword. And because he tries desperately to get this land back in France, he ends up making the barons pay huge amounts of taxes to pay for all his armies, but he loses, and all those taxes really end up going down the drain. And it's the taxes that he charges the barons and the unfair fines that he makes to get money out of them that eventually leads them to getting fed up with him and forcing him to sign the Magna Carta. But John has also had has big religious problems too. So in 1205, John argues with the Pope over who should be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. And in 1208, the Pope issues what's called an interdict, which basically blocks all church services. So burials, funerals, baptisms, marriages, for example, all of those stop in 1208 on the order of the Pope. And John, because he's arguing with the Pope over who should be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, he basically punishes monks who are people who give their life for the church by taking away church property, money and land. So he kind of gets revenge on the church by doing this. And in 1209, the Pope goes one step further and he actually excommunicates John, which basically means that John's soul is destined to go to hell when he dies. So there's a big argument between John and the church, and in the end, John does give in to the Pope in 1213, but not after the two of them have exchanged blows for a while. Now, what I'd like you to do is have a look at this source here for me, because we know that John was unpopular with the barons, and we know that he wasn't very popular with the church either, but we're going to be looking at some source evidence now and thinking about what this can tell us about King John. So have a look at the picture and pause the video for a second and think very carefully about what you can see in this image and what it tells us about King John. Okay, so pause it and give it a go. Okay, so there's a couple of things then I want to point out for you. So this source was made in by someone called Matthew Paris. Was somebody who didn't like King John very much, and there's a few areas that I want to draw your attention to. So firstly, you notice the crown on his head doesn't fit him properly. It's actually slipping off his head. So the idea here is that King John wasn't really meant to be king, hence the crown doesn't fit him. Not only that, but the robes that he's wearing, the green robes, are sort of falling off his shoulders, again suggesting that he's a bit weak and that he really shouldn't be king. And the church, the pointy steeples in the background, which is the church, you can see he's got his back turned towards it, which again is not really a good sign. Perhaps it's suggesting that he ignored the church, or that he's turning his back on the church, which again is a kind of bad thing when people were so religious at this time. So this is not a particularly positive source about King John, and the person who made this was trying to show others that he didn't think King John was a very good king. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to look at some sources which were written in the past, so hundreds of years ago, and what they tell us about King John. So you've got a worksheet which I've attached to class charts, and what you're going to do, using the worksheet and using the handout that I've also sent you, you're going to read the sources and think about what they tell us about King John, and you're going to write in the box on the table where the source goes. So for example, number 1 says John lost Normandy and many other lands because of his laziness. He always took money from his people and destroyed their property. He hated his wife and she hated him. He gave orders that her lovers were to be throttled on her bed, which means strangled. And John was jealous of many barons and seduced their daughters and sisters, and he was a tyrant. A tyrant means a really bad king, like a monster, basically. So for this one, it says John lost Normandy and many other lands because he was lazy. So perhaps what we could put here is John was a poor warrior, and we could put source 1 because it says that he lost land in Normandy. So that would be evidence of John being a bad warrior that we get from that particular source. What I'd like you to do is read the other 5 sources on page 10 and 11, and then fill in that table on your worksheet, please. Once you've completed that, have a go at question 2 and summarize in 50 words what were the main criticisms that the people in these sources were making of King John. When you're finished, please unpause the video. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to look at all those sources and hopefully fill in your table, you might have noticed that all of the sources are quite negative about King John, and they all have one thing in common, and that is that they were written by these guys. They were written by monks. So as I briefly touched on before, a monk is somebody who dedicates their whole life to prayer, a bit like in some ways a priest who gives their life to God and takes a vow of celibacy, for example. Monks were people who would spend all their time in a monastery, and they would pray to God, and they would do various things for the community, but one of which was they would write things down. They would document history. And monks were one of the few people in medieval society who could read and write. So when we looked at medieval peasants, most people couldn't read or write at all. They didn't need to for their everyday life, but monks were one of the few educated people in England who could actually write stuff down. And so one of their jobs was to do what's called chronicles, was to write things down so that people in the future could read about the past. Now, that's great, but the problem with it is that if the monks didn't like you, which in the case of King John they didn't, the things they wrote down were often quite negative, quite one-sided. Here's an example of that. Here's 2 headlines. Dogs are the worst pets in the world, fact. Hang on a minute, who wrote this one? It's Cat News. So unsurprisingly, if you ask cats to write the headlines, they're probably going to write things about dogs that are not very nice. Likewise, breaking news, teachers are actually aliens from Mars. This is not true, we're actually from Venus. But if you look carefully, you can see that the website this is from is studentswhohateteachers.com. So again, we need to be really careful as historians. Whenever we read something, we need to think about, well, who wrote this and why did they write it? Because who writes it and when they wrote it and why they write it is often an important way of checking whether we can fully trust that. In the words of Trump, we've got to work out if this is fake news or not. I never thought I'd quote Trump before. So when we look at a source in history, we need to put it through a few checks. We need to check firstly who wrote it, why they wrote it, when did they write it, and what did they actually write. So we need to think about the person who wrote this. Were they trying to write this because they didn't like somebody, or they were trying to influence other people to think the same way? Why did they do this? Was it to make somebody look good or make somebody look bad? When did they write it? Did they even meet the person? Were they alive when this person that they're writing about was alive at the same time? Or are they basing their information on gossip or rumors or something they've heard from somebody else? And what did they actually write? Was it true? Was it based on fact or evidence? What evidence did they look at when they wrote their source down? These are all the kind of questions we need to ask as historians when looking at a piece of source evidence. And we then, once we've done that, we can decide how trustworthy a source is. So you're going to have a go at that now. You're going to read page 12 and 13 of the handout that I gave you, and you're going to think really carefully about who wrote the sources and how that's going to affect its reliability. So for example, source 1 is written by a guy called Matthew Paris. The truth is that Matthew Paris was not alive when King John was alive. King John had already died before he was writing his information down. And he based a lot of his ideas and evidence on the work of a guy called Roger of Wendover, who was a monk who didn't like King John. So unsurprisingly, a lot of his sources, a lot of the stuff that he wrote down about King John was pretty bad, pretty negative. But if we had to decide and fill in our table, how reliable is he? I'd probably give him a 1. And the reason for that? Well, he wasn't alive when King John was alive, and he based all of his evidence and ideas on people who lived before him who didn't like King John. So it's very one-sided, isn't it, what he's writing? So I would give it a 1, and my reason for that would be what I just described. So you're going to have a go at reading that information on page 12 and 13, and then filling in the second table on your handout, giving each source a score out of 5, 5 meaning very reliable, 1 being not reliable at all, and then a reason for that rating. And once you've done that, have a go at question 4, which is explaining why do you think so many of the sources about King John that historians have today, why do you think so many of them are so negative? And I've kind of given you the clue for that one already. All right, pause the video, give it a go, and when you're finished, please unpause. Okay, so what we've seen then is a lot of the sources that we have when we look at King John are all written by the church. And of course, the church and the Pope, the Pope and King John fell out for the longest time. And that might mean that when we think about the sources and what they tell us about King John, that they're always going to be a bit one-sided, they're going to be a bit negative. So with that in mind, now that we've spent some time today thinking about the source evidence that we've got for King John, what we need to do now is think about, as historians, what are our golden rules? What are 5 things that we must do when we look at source evidence to make sure that we're doing a good job? So this is what I'd like you to do as your final task today. So for example, one of the questions that you might think is a golden rule, always think about who wrote it. Who wrote it? We need to know about the person, the author. That could be one of your golden rules. Can you think of another 4 things that historians should always do when they're looking at sources based on what you've learned today? 5 golden rules for them to follow. Okay, once you've finished, please submit your work to me on ClassCharts, and thank you as always, Year 7, for your continued hard work.